Life in solitary, inside Pelican Bay State Prison. The man who spoke to no one for 10 years. The cell door slammed shut with a sound so loud it felt like the walls shook. Inside sat a man, alone. No windows, no sunlight, no human touch. For 10 years, this man lived inside a concrete box, speaking to no one, hearing only the echo of his own voice. The guards called it the SHU, the Security Housing Unit. But to inmates, it was simply the end of the world. Some men lost their minds in months. Others built strange worlds in their heads. But the question is, what really happens to a human being when every second of life is lived in solitary confinement? That's what we're about to uncover. The box. Pelican Bay was not like other prisons. It wasn't built to rehabilitate. It wasn't even built just to punish. It was designed to control. The SHU, solitary housing, was the most feared part of it all. Cells were small, cold, and gray. No clock, no TV, no sunlight. Just a steel door and 4 walls. Inmates lived there for 23 hours a day. Their only break? 1 hour in a yard, but it wasn't really a yard. It was a concrete pen with walls so high you couldn't see the sky. The only light came from a thin strip of sun above your head. At first, men tried to resist. They counted steps back and forth. They memorized every scratch on the wall. They tapped codes through the vents to other cells. Morse code, prison code, anything just to feel human. But the silence was crushing. Some men shouted into the air until their voices broke. Others curled up in a corner and refused to move for days. And when someone finally snapped, everyone else in the SHU heard it. One night, an inmate started laughing, loud, wild laughter that went on for hours. Then it turned to screaming. Then to sobbing. The sound traveled down the tier like a ghost. Other inmates banged their doors to drown it out. Some screamed back. But the laughter kept echoing. That night, the SHU wasn't just solitary. It was madness. Mind games. Life in solitary was not just about walls, it was about survival of the mind. The guards knew it. The inmates knew it. Prisoners created entire systems just to keep their sanity. Some made imaginary friends. Others replayed every memory of their childhood over and over, until it felt like a movie. One man claimed he traveled the world in his head, describing every detail to himself. Paris, New York, Mexico, though he had never left California. The guards called these men programmed. They were alive but only inside their own minds. But not everyone could hold it together. Men who once led gangs on the streets of Los Angeles or Oakland broke down in weeks. They scratched their arms until they bled. They banged on steel doors until their fists were raw. Some begged the guards just to talk to them for a minute. But guards didn't talk. They watched. They waited. And sometimes they pushed. Food was slid through a slot. If you made eye contact, the guard might smirk and slam it shut without a word. Other times they would accidentally skip your shower day. For a man in solitary, that shower wasn't just about cleaning. It was about feeling alive. It was about touching water, smelling soap, being outside your cell for 10 minutes. So when guards skipped it, men went wild. They screamed, they cursed, they kicked the steel. But nothing changed. And then one inmate snapped so violently he set his mattress on fire. Smoke filled the cell. He pounded on the door, choking. Guards rushed in, dragging him out coughing, his skin burned. The other inmates could smell the smoke for days. And in solitary, the smell was a reminder. This place could kill you without ever laying a hand on you. The gang in the walls. Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't just for random inmates. It was built for gangs. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, Norteños, Serenos, all of them had leaders locked away in the SHU. But here's the truth, solitary didn't kill gang power. It concentrated it. Inmates tapped codes through the pipes, whispered messages through vents, even smuggled tiny notes called kites. Orders for hits, drug deals, and riots flowed through the walls. Some say the SHU was the real gang headquarters of California. The guards tried to stop it, but the gangs adapted. One blink through the slot could send a signal. One word in a food tray could carry a death order. And if you refused to play the game, you became a target. There was a man once, new to the SHU, who refused to follow gang orders. He thought solitary would protect him. He was wrong. One night, his screams echoed through the tier. He had been attacked in his own cell. Oh, nobody knew. The doors were locked. The guards swore they didn't open it. But by morning his blood was on the floor. And the message was clear. Even in solitary the gangs ruled. The hunger strike. By the early 2000s inmates had reached a breaking point. Decades in solitary. No sunlight. No touch. No future. So they fought back the only way they could. Their bodies. Thousands of inmates went on hunger strike. Trays of food slid through the slots, but men pushed them back out. Days turned into weeks. Some men dropped to the floor, weak, shaking. Others collapsed and had to be carried out on stretchers. The strike spread through Pelican Bay like wildfire. It wasn't about one gang, one man, it was about everyone. Black, white, Latino. Different groups came together in a way that shocked even the guards. The world outside finally started to pay attention. Lawyers, activists, and families protested. Reporters asked, "Is this torture?" But inside the SHU, inmates were still falling. One man lost 40 pounds in weeks. Another nearly died before guards force-fed him through a tube. And then, after months of struggle, the hunger strike forced change. Courts began questioning long-term solitary. For the first time, the world saw what Pelican Bay was really doing. But change didn't come fast enough. Because just as the strike ended, violence inside the SHU exploded again. The breaking point. After years in solitary, some men stopped being human. They forgot how to talk. They forgot how to smile. They forgot what it felt like to be touched by another person. The SHU created ghosts. Men who stared blankly at walls for hours. Men who muttered to themselves nonstop. Men who cut their own arms just to feel something. Psychologists who visited said it was like watching a slow death. But to the guards it was just another day at work. One evening an inmate sat perfectly still in his cell. Hours passed. No movement. No sound. When guards finally checked, he was gone, dead by his own hand. That night, silence fell across the SHU. Not the usual silence of concrete and steel. This was heavier. Every man in every cell felt it. Because in that moment they knew. If solitary could break him, it could break anyone. And yet, the SHU continued. Doors slammed shut. Trays slid through slots. Time marched on. But for the men locked inside Pelican Bay solitary, time wasn't measured in days or years. It was measured in something far darker. How long until you break? The silence war. In the SHU, silence was both weapon and punishment. Most days the only sounds were doors slamming, guards' boots on concrete, or the faint clank of a food tray sliding through a slot. But silence also became a battlefield. Prisoners fought it in strange ways. Some sang old songs at night just to fill the air. Others made instruments out of anything they could find, beating spoons against pipes, tapping rhythms on the wall. One man became famous on the tier for whistling. Every night he whistled old country tunes. At first, other inmates laughed. Then they waited for it. It was like a reminder that someone was still alive out there. But guards didn't like it. They warned him to stop. When he didn't, they cut off his yard time for weeks. No sunlight. No fresh air. Just punishment. That night the whistling stopped. The silence returned. Then hours later, screams erupted. The man had smashed his head into the wall until he collapsed, blood running down his face. The silence had won. Letters that never came. One of the few lifelines inmates had in solitary was letters. A piece of paper, a few words from the outside. It could mean everything. Prisoners wrote daily. Some wrote to wives. Some wrote to children. Others wrote to strangers just to have a connection. But not all letters arrived. Many were lost. Others were held back for weeks, even months, by guards. It was a silent form of control. Imagine waiting 30 days hoping to hear your daughter's voice in ink, only to be told, nothing for you. Some inmates never got letters at all. Their families had cut them off. No one wrote. No one remembered. Those were the men who fell apart the fastest. Without letters, without hope, they stopped eating. They stopped talking. They just faded. One prisoner, desperate, ripped his shirt and wrote a letter on it with his own blood. He pushed it under the door, begging a guard to mail it. The guard laughed, kicked it aside, and walked away. The next morning, the man was gone, taken to the prison hospital after slashing his wrists. The other inmates heard the gurney roll past their cells. And every man wondered if the next letter they never got would be the one that broke them too. The monster inside. Solitary didn't just break men. It changed them. The SHU created monsters. Some men began talking to shadows, swearing voices whispered in the dark. Others invented enemies who didn't exist, screaming at the air, punching at invisible hands. Psychologists called it SHU syndrome. The prison called it acting out. But to the men living it, it was a nightmare. One prisoner, once a quiet man, started pacing non-stop, day and night. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't stop. His bare feet bled from the concrete floor. When guards finally opened his cell, he attacked them like a wild animal, biting, scratching, clawing. It took 6 men to pin him down. When they strapped him to a gurney, he laughed like a child. The SHU had turned him into something else. And the terrifying truth? Every man in solitary knew. Could happen to them next. The riot that never happened. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed to stop riots. No crowds, no groups, no gatherings. But that didn't mean the idea of rebellion died. Prisoners passed secret messages planning something huge. They wanted every man in solitary to bang, scream, and refuse food on the same night. One unified act of defiance. For weeks, the plan spread through whispers in the vents. Guards suspected something, but they didn't know when it would happen. The night came. At midnight, a deep pounding shook the tier, hundreds of fists slamming steel doors in rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. The walls trembled. Shouts filled the air. Names of gangs. Names of families. Screams of freedom. Guards panicked, running back and forth, shouting orders. They thought a riot was exploding. And then, silence. All at once. The prisoners stopped as if nothing had happened. The SHU went dead quiet. That silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was proof. Even locked in boxes, the inmates had power. And the guards could never predict what came next. The ghost of the SHU. By the 2010s, Pelican Bay's SHU had built a reputation so dark, inmates whispered about it like a legend. Men said the SHU ate your soul. They called it a living grave. But there was one story that spread more than others. The story of the ghost. Inmates swore there was a man who had lived in solitary so long, no one remembered his name. He never spoke. He never wrote. He never asked for yard time. He just existed. Guards treated him like furniture, something in the corner. Inmates whispered through vents about hearing him move, shuffle, breathe. But nobody ever saw his face. And then one morning his cell was empty. No transfer papers. No explanation. Nothing. Some said he died in the night. Others believed he was still there, hidden deeper in the prison. To this day, men in the SHU say they hear him breathing in the dark. Whether true or not, one thing was certain. At Pelican Bay, men could vanish without a trace. And that was more terrifying than death itself. The daylight illusion. For men in solitary, sunlight became a memory. The only yard time they had was a small pen, 4 walls of concrete with a sliver of sky. No trees. No horizon. No freedom. Inmates described it as standing at the bottom of a well. You tilted your head back and hoped for sunlight to fall on your face. Sometimes it did. Most times it didn't. Some prisoners started to imagine daylight inside their cells. They closed their eyes and pictured beaches, city streets, or just a simple backyard. One man swore he could feel the warmth of the sun even though he was in a freezing cell. It was his way of surviving. But not everyone could keep the illusion alive. One afternoon, an inmate returned from the yard and refused to step back inside. He screamed at guards, clinging to the gate, begging to stay under the sky. When they dragged him back into the SHU, his cries echoed for hours. "Don't take the sun from me." That night, he ripped his mattress open, shredded it into pieces, and spread it across the cell floor like grass. The guards laughed. But for him, it was the only sunlight he had left. The sound of madness. The SHU was supposed to be silent, but silence was never truly silent. There were noises, small, strange, constant. Pipes rattled. Metal groaned. Footsteps echoed. And sometimes voices seemed to whisper when no one was there. For inmates already on edge, these sounds became monsters. Some thought the prison itself was alive, breathing through the vents. Others swore they heard people calling their names in the dark. One prisoner began shouting back at the voices, holding entire conversations with thin air. At first, other inmates laughed. Then it stopped being funny. Because more men started hearing the same things. The SHU had a way of making your mind play tricks. But to the men living inside, those tricks felt real. And then one night, the sounds weren't imaginary. A guard slammed a baton against the doors, walking the tier in silence except for that sharp, metallic bang. Over and over. Bang, bang, bang. It echoed until prisoners screamed at him to stop. But he didn't. He kept going until morning. By the time the shift changed, half the tier was shouting, crying, or pounding their doors in rage. The silence was gone. And madness had taken its place. The visit that never came. Visits in the SHU were rare, and when they happened, they weren't face-to-face. Prisoners sat in a booth, staring through thick glass at their families. They spoke through phones. No hugs. No touch. For many, it was the only thing keeping them alive, the hope of seeing a wife, a child, or even just a familiar face. But sometimes visits never came. Men would sit in the booth for hours waiting. No one showed up. The glass stayed empty. One man waited for his mother. She had promised she would come. He pressed his hand against the glass, staring, whispering her name. But she never walked in. The guard finally told him, "She's not coming." When he was dragged back to his cell, he collapsed on the floor, silent. For days he refused food. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't live. And then, during a count, the guards opened his cell to find him hanging by a torn sheet. The visit that never came had taken his last hope. The invisible chains. Even in solitary, men were shackled. Whenever they left the cell, whether for medical visits, showers, or the small yard, they were cuffed, chained, and escorted by guards. The shackles were heavy. They cut into ankles and wrists. The sound of chains clinking against concrete was constant. Prisoners began to dream about chains. Some swore they could still feel the weight even when lying in bed. It was as if the metal had become part of their bodies. One inmate described it as being a ghost tied to the earth. No matter where you went, the chains followed. But sometimes those chains were used for more than control. Guards tightened them too hard, watching as wrists turned purple. They left men in holding cages for hours, chained, unable to move. And one day an inmate collapsed in chains, his chest heaving. The guards thought he was faking. They laughed and walked away. Minutes later he stopped breathing. By the time medical staff arrived, it was too late. The chains that were meant to control had become his final prison. The fire in the dark. The SHU had seen many desperate acts, but nothing compared to the fire. It started with a single spark. An inmate set his sheets on fire, trying to get attention. The smoke filled his cell, but before guards could react, the flames spread to another. Inmates began lighting whatever they could: paper, clothes, even scraps of mattress foam. The tier filled with thick, black smoke. Men screamed for help, coughing, choking, banging on their doors. Alarms blared. Guards rushed in with fire extinguishers, dragging men out one by one. But in the chaos, something terrifying happened. One prisoner refused to leave his burning cell. He stood in the flames, staring at the wall, silent. When guards pulled him out, his skin was blistered, his eyes empty. He whispered just 4 words. "Better fire than silence." The flames were put out. The tier was cleaned. Life went back to normal. But the smell of smoke lingered for weeks. And for the men who lived through it, the fire was a reminder. Some would rather burn than live another day in solitary. The calendar that lied. In solitary, time itself became an enemy. Days blended into weeks. Weeks into months. Some men scratched calendars into the wall just to keep track. But the problem was, they were often wrong. Without sunlight, without clocks, a man's sense of time twisted. Some thought only a few weeks had passed, when it had been 6 months. Others swore they'd been in the SHU for years, but the truth was only 90 days. One prisoner drew a full year on his wall. Every day he marked another scratch. On what he thought was New Year's Eve, he banged his door, shouting, "Happy New Year." But when he asked the guard the date, he learned it was only May. The realization shattered him. He ripped his calendar off the wall, smeared it with his own blood, and refused to eat. For him, the SHU had stolen not just his freedom but his very sense of reality. And then one night his cell went quiet. Too quiet. By morning he was gone, taken out under a white sheet. The window to nowhere. Some SHU cells had tiny windows. Not real ones, just slits in the concrete. They didn't look outside to trees or sky or streets. Instead, they opened into blank walls or narrow shafts of light. Still, for men trapped inside, those slits became treasures. They stared through them for hours, hoping to see a bird, a plane, anything alive. Some claimed they could see shadows moving, guards, staff, maybe other inmates. One man said he saw the outline of a woman walking by every morning. He swore she waved at him. The other prisoners laughed, saying it was impossible. But to him that wave was the only thing keeping him sane. Then one morning the shadow didn't appear. He screamed for hours, banging his head against the wall, begging to see her again. Guards dragged him out, bleeding and broken. And the slit in the wall stayed empty. For the rest of the tier, it was a cruel reminder. Even hope in Pelican Bay could disappear overnight. The cage fights. The SHU was built to keep men apart. But sometimes guards brought 2 prisoners into the same yard, a concrete cage barely big enough for a few steps. It was supposed to be exercise. But in reality it was often war. Men who hadn't seen another face in years were suddenly thrown into a cage together. Tension snapped fast. One wrong look, one wrong word, and fists flew. With nowhere to run, it was fight or bleed. Inmates later said guards enjoyed it, like setting up dog fights. They'd watch from above, waiting for the violence. One day, two rival gang members were placed together. Within seconds it was chaos, blood splattering on the concrete, bodies slamming against walls. The guards didn't stop it. Not right away. They let it play out until one man lay motionless on the ground. When they finally intervened, the yard was soaked in blood. And the surviving inmate was dragged away in chains, his face broken but his eyes burning with rage. That day proved something chilling. Even in solitary, Pelican Bay could turn men into weapons. The dreams that hurt. Sleep in the SHU was never peaceful. Some nights the light stayed on. Other nights the cold kept men shivering awake. And when they did sleep, the dreams came. Many inmates said their dreams were worse than reality. They dreamed of freedom, hugging their kids, eating at a kitchen table, walking through their old neighborhoods. But waking up was torture. Because the cell was still there. The walls were still gray. The door was still locked. One prisoner said the dreams were so painful, he trained himself not to sleep. He stayed awake for days, pacing, muttering, scratching his arms until they bled. When his body finally collapsed, the dreams hit him harder than ever. And then one night, screams echoed through the tier. He woke up thrashing, convinced he was being buried alive. Guards rushed in, strapping him down as he begged to be let out of the grave. For him, solitary had blurred the line between dream and nightmare. And for the others listening, it was proof. The SHU didn't just haunt your days, it stole your nights too. The escape that never was. In a place built to crush hope, the idea of escape was the only fantasy left. Inmates whispered through vents about digging tunnels, bribing guards, even breaking through the roof. Most knew it was impossible. But the dream kept them alive. One group of prisoners actually tried. They used broken pieces of metal to chip away at the wall behind their bunks, hiding the dust in small bags under the bed. For weeks they worked in silence, convinced they were close to breaking through. Then one morning guards stormed the tier. The entire block was searched. When they reached the cell they found the hole. It wasn't even 6 inches deep. The men were dragged out, beaten, and sent to disciplinary cells even darker than before. Word spread fast. No one escapes Pelican Bay. But for the men left behind, the attempt was both inspiring and terrifying. If even the dream of escape was impossible, what hope was left? The cold that burned. Pelican Bay's SHU was always cold. Concrete floors, steel doors, no heating strong enough to warm the cells. Prisoners wrapped themselves in thin blankets, shivering through the night. But it wasn't just discomfort, it was control. Guards used the cold as punishment. Sometimes they left windows cracked open in winter. Sometimes they handed out wet towels instead of dry ones after showers, forcing men to dry off in freezing air. The cold sank into bones. It made hands tremble, teeth chatter, and bodies ache. Inmates called it the burn, because after hours of shivering the cold didn't just sting, it hurt. One winter night, temperatures dropped close to freezing. An inmate begged for an extra blanket. The guard laughed, saying, "You'll live." By morning the man's lips were blue, his body stiff. Medical staff rushed him out, but it was too late. The rest of the tier whispered for days about it, not because a man had died, but because everyone knew it could have been them. The Whisper Network. Even in total isolation, prisoners found ways to talk. They whispered through vents, tapped codes into pipes, and shouted across the tiers when guards weren't around. Through these secret networks, entire stories spread. News from outside, prison gossip, even survival tips. A new inmate could learn everything he needed to know just by listening. But whispers also carried danger. Rumors of snitches spread fast. If someone was accused of working with guards, the whole tier would turn against him. One night, a man shouted through the vent that his cellmate had snitched before he was transferred. Within hours, other prisoners began banging on their doors, chanting, "Snitch, snitch, snitch." The accused man screamed back, denying it. But the whispers didn't stop. The next morning he was found unconscious, blood pooling around him. No one knew how it happened inside a locked cell. But everyone understood the message. Whispers could kill. The forgotten men. In the outside world, families moved on. Children grew up. Wives remarried. Friends disappeared. For men in the SHU it felt like being erased. One by one their ties to the world vanished. Mail stopped coming. Visits stopped. Phone calls were rare, and even when they came they were short and cold. One man wrote dozens of letters to his son over the years. Every week he asked about school, about life, about growing up. He never got a reply. Then one day a guard slipped him a note. "Your son's in prison now too." The man dropped the letter. His entire body shook. His greatest fear had come true. His own child had followed him into the system. That night, his screams echoed so loudly that the whole block stayed awake. Not even steel doors could contain the sound of a father breaking. The Hall of Echoes. At night, the SHU transformed into something almost supernatural. With no outside noise, every sound bounced and echoed endlessly. A cough from one cell traveled down the entire tier. A shout sounded like 100 voices. A single kick against a door rattled like thunder. Some inmates used the echoes to their advantage. They created chants, making it sound like dozens of men were screaming in unison. Others used it to spread fear, whispering threats that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But sometimes the echoes created nightmares. One prisoner said he heard voices calling his name every night, though no one admitted to shouting it. Another swore he heard children laughing in the distance. Then one evening the echoes grew into chaos. Someone started screaming. Others joined in. The sound bounced and grew until the entire block shook with noise. Guards stormed the tier, swinging batons, spraying gas. But the echoes swallowed everything. For hours the SHU was nothing but screams. The day the lights went out. For years, prisoners complained about the constant light in their cells. Fluorescent bulbs glowed day and night, making it hard to sleep. But one night something different happened. The lights went out. All of them. The SHU was plunged into darkness. At first, men cheered. It was the first true night they'd had in years. But soon the dark became terrifying. Without light, the prison felt alive. Every sound was amplified. Every shadow seemed to move. Some prisoners curled in corners, whispering prayers. Others banged their doors, demanding answers. Hours passed. The darkness dragged on. Some men swore they saw shapes moving inside their cells. Others said they felt hands brushing against them in the black. When the lights finally flickered back on, guards said it was just a power outage. But for the men inside it felt like something else. As if the prison itself had shown them just how helpless they really were. The artwork of desperation. In the SHU there were no paintbrushes, no pencils, no colors. But men found ways to create. They drew on walls with soap, etched words into concrete with paper clips, or painted with coffee stains. Some of the art was beautiful. Portraits of families, landscapes of places they would never see again. Others were disturbing, dark figures, skulls, and twisted faces that came straight from the mind of men unraveling. One inmate became known for his wall murals. Using toothpaste and ashes, he covered every inch of his cell in drawings. It was his way of surviving, filling the emptiness with images. But one morning, guards stormed his cell and sprayed it down. Every image vanished in minutes. When he saw his art destroyed, the man dropped to the ground and refused to move. He lay silent for days, staring at the blank concrete. The message was clear. In Pelican Bay, even your imagination wasn't safe. The medical mirage. Medical care in the SHU was limited. Doctors rarely came. Requests for treatment were often ignored. If you had a headache, you got aspirin. If you had chest pains, they told you to drink water. Even serious injuries were brushed aside. One inmate begged for help with stomach pain. For weeks, guards told him he was faking. Finally, when he collapsed in his cell, they dragged him to medical. He died hours later, ruptured appendix. News spread quickly through the tier. Men shouted through the vents, furious, scared, demanding answers. But the prison stayed silent. For the rest of the inmates, it was another reminder. Inside the SHU, pain didn't matter. Only survival did. The messages in the pipes. The plumbing in Pelican Bay carried more than water. It carried voices. Prisoners discovered that if you flushed at the same time as someone else, you could speak through the toilets like telephones. It became the SHU's underground communication system, the pipeline. Through it, inmates planned strikes, traded information, and even shared personal stories. One man said it was the only way he ever heard another person laugh. But the pipeline was dangerous. Guards knew about it. If they caught you, they shut off your water for days. One night, guards found out two rival gang leaders were talking through the pipes. They stormed the tier, dragging both men out in chains. No one ever saw them again. After that, the toilets went silent. But the memory of voices echoing through steel pipes lingered, like ghosts in the walls. The man who stopped talking. Some prisoners fought solitary by talking non-stop, yelling, singing, arguing with guards. But others went the opposite way. They stopped talking altogether. One man was known for being loud, always shouting through the vents. Then one day he went silent. No more words. No more banging. Just silence. At first, other inmates thought he was playing a game. But weeks passed and he never spoke again. Guards said he still moved, still ate, still walked during yard time. But he never spoke. Not one word. Some inmates swore they saw him staring at the walls, mouthing words only he could hear. Others said he had chosen silence as a weapon, refusing to give the prison anything, not even his voice. But one night, guards found him on the floor, motionless. He had written 2 words on the wall with a piece of metal. "I'm done." The flood. Water was life inside the SHU. Every drop was controlled. But sometimes water itself became a weapon. Inmates clogged their toilets and sinks, flooding their cells in protest. The water soaked mattresses, clothes, and blankets. It turned concrete floors into swamps. For some, it was rebellion. For others, it was madness. One night, an entire tier decided to flood at once. Water poured under doors, rushing into the hallway like a river. Guards waded through, shouting, slipping, dragging men out. The smell of sewage filled the air. Prisoners laughed, screamed, and banged their doors as the water rose. For a few minutes, it felt like they had taken control. But when the water was drained and the cells cleaned, punishment came hard. Days with no yard. Cold meals. Extra shackles. And one man, caught with a piece of metal used to clog his sink, was dragged out, beaten, and never seen again. The flood was over. But the memory of rushing water stayed in every cell. Because in the SHU, even water could spark chaos. The hunger for touch. One of the cruelest parts of solitary wasn't the silence. It wasn't even the darkness. It was the absence of touch. Months turned into years without a handshake, a hug, or even a pat on the shoulder. Prisoners said they craved it more than food. One man admitted he purposely picked fights with guards, just to feel their hands holding him down. Another inmate described holding his own hands together at night, pretending it was someone else's. For him, even that illusion was better than nothing. But the hunger for touch broke some men completely. One day, a prisoner reached through the food slot, grabbing a guard's arm and refusing to let go. He cried as they shocked him with stun guns, begging for just one more second of human contact. The SHU wasn't just breaking bodies. It was starving souls. The lawsuit. As stories of Pelican Bay's SHU spread outside, lawyers and activists began fighting back. They argued that years of solitary confinement wasn't just punishment, it was torture. Lawsuits were filed. Families protested. Former prisoners testified about hallucinations, suicides, and broken minds. For the first time, the outside world began to listen. Judges asked questions. Politicians demanded answers. The state was forced to defend the SHU system. Inside, inmates waited for news. Some prayed the lawsuits would set them free. Others refused to believe it, saying hope was the most dangerous thing of all. But when the first rulings came down, they shook the prison system. Long-term solitary, decades in the SHU, was ruled unconstitutional for many prisoners. For some men it was too late. They had already lost their minds. But for others, it meant a chance at daylight again. The release. After years in solitary, some men were finally moved back into general population. For them, freedom meant walking into a yard with other people again. It meant hearing conversations. It meant seeing the sky without walls. But freedom wasn't easy. Men who had lived in silence for decades didn't know how to talk anymore. Some froze when others got too close. Others had panic attacks at the sound of laughter, voices, or crowds. One man was released from the SHU after 15 years. On his first day back, he stepped into the yard, dropped to his knees, and wept. The sun blinded him. The air felt too big. It was as if the world itself was overwhelming. But for every man who stepped out, another remained trapped inside. Because the SHU never truly closed. The shadows that stayed. Even for those who left solitary, the SHU followed them. They called it the box inside the brain. A place you carried forever. Some men said they still counted cracks on the wall in their heads. Others still woke up screaming from dreams of concrete and chains. One man, free for years, admitted he still whispered through vents at night, because he had forgotten how to fall asleep in silence. Families noticed too. Husbands, fathers, brothers came home but seemed like strangers. They sat in corners during family dinners. They jumped at small noises. They couldn't stand crowds. The SHU didn't just end at Pelican Bay. It leaked out into homes, neighborhoods, entire communities. Its shadow was long. And it never truly disappeared. The end of the box. Today, the SHU at Pelican Bay is no longer what it once was. Lawsuits and protests forced change. Some men were moved. Policies shifted. The most extreme sentences of decades in solitary were rolled back. But the debate isn't over. Supporters say solitary is needed for dangerous inmates. Critics say it's torture that destroys human beings. And the truth? For thousands of men across America, solitary confinement still exists. Different names, different prisons, but the same cold box, the same silence, the same endless cycle. For Pelican Bay, the SHU became a symbol. A place where men were buried alive in concrete. A place where time, touch, and hope disappeared. A place that proved, you don't need bars to build a cage. Sometimes, the mind becomes the prison. The question that remains. So, what does life in solitary really mean? It means days without sunlight. Nights without dreams. Years without human touch. It means losing track of time until you don't know if you're alive or already gone. Pelican Bay's SHU showed the world what happens when you lock a human being away from everything that makes life human. Some survived. Some didn't. And some are still there, counting the cracks on the wall, waiting for a door that may never open. The question isn't just what solitary does to prisoners. The question is what it does to us, to a society that allows it. Because when a prison takes away not just freedom, but the very essence of being human, we all have to ask, is this justice? Or is this something far darker?